Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson. Now, The Shrinking Man was published in 1956, and this is probably Matheson's most well-known novel, next to I Am Legend, and I actually do think there are a lot of thematic similarities between this and I Am Legend. Both books have premises that, if done by a lesser writer, could have been really silly. I Am Legend is a book about vampires taking over the Earth, and there being only one human survivor of this vampire apocalypse. A silly premise, but what elevates I Am Legend is the fact that it's more of a study on human loss and loneliness and isolation and the psychological effects of isolation. This book has kind of the same thing going for it, where it's an absolutely ludicrous premise, the idea of a man shrinking, but Matheson takes that premise and uses it to actually make a statement about masculinity and what it meant to be a man in 1950s America, and also about the importance of size in relationship dynamics. And Matheson also injects realism into it. He makes you buy this really outlandish premise. Yes, this is nothing that can ever happen in real life, but he kinda gets you to believe it. And it's a much smarter and much more mature novel than you might be expecting. Now, Richard Matheson actually got the idea for this novel after seeing a 1953 comedy called Let's Do It Again. Now, that movie had nothing to do with shrinking or anything like that, but there's a scene in the movie where a character walks out of somebody's apartment, and apparently he puts on somebody else's hat, and the hat comes down over his ears. And this gave Matheson the idea, what if a man put on a hat that he knew for a fact was his, and the same thing happened? Now, the plot of The Shrinking Man is it's about a man named Scott Carey, who in the beginning of the story, while boating with his brother is like down below deck, and all of a sudden the boat is hit with this radioactive spray. Scott doesn't find out till later on that it was radioactive. But what happens is, throughout the novel, he starts shrinking. This all happens over the course of many, many months, but over the months he gets progressively smaller and smaller, and soon it becomes apparent that this is not going to stop. And the book is told in a very non-linear fashion, where a lot of it is taking place in this basement where Scott is less than an inch tall, so he has no way of getting out of the basement, and at this point, his family thinks he's probably dead. And throughout the novel, he's trying to survive in this basement, being less than an inch tall, while he's also being terrorized by what, from his point of view, is a giant spider. It's actually a regular-sized spider, but from his point of view, it's giant. And throughout the novel, there are flashbacks that lead up to him eventually getting trapped in the cellar. And in these flashbacks, you find out how this horrible situation affected his relationships with his brother and his wife and daughter. You also find out that the media eventually found out about him, and he became a national celebrity, whether he liked it or not. Now, The Shrinking Man is an excellent science fiction novel, and what really works about it is, as I said, the sense of realism that Matheson brings to it. Like, of course it's not a realistic story, but Matheson grounds it in such a way where he makes it as reality-based as a story like this could possibly be. Like, believe it or not, he handles the whole idea of a man shrinking to being less than an inch tall actually pretty realistically, where he's like, okay, if a man really did shrink to that size, what would he do for food? What would he do for clothes? And at this size, animals that humans normally tower over, like Black Widow spiders or cats, end up being deadly predators to him. Now, of course this is more science fiction than horror, but I do think there are some definite horror elements in this novel, especially all the stuff dealing with the spider. Now, there are a lot of things in this book where you could tell this was published in the 50s, and then there are a lot of things where you're like, holy shit, Matheson was actually really ahead of his time. Like, during the flashbacks, there's a certain point where Scott is walking by the side of a road, and at this point he has shrunken down to the size of a 12-year-old boy, and a man picks him up thinking he's a little kid, and this man turns out to be a child molester, and I was like, wow. Like, I almost couldn't believe that something like that was in a book written around this time period. Now, I'm sure there were probably just as many perverts and sickos back in the 50s as there are today, but today we just know more about them. And I'm not saying people back in the 50s didn't worry about that kind of thing, but not to the same extent that people do today. So in a lot of ways, Matheson was really ahead of his time, at least with that particular scene in the book. Now, as I said already, there are a lot of themes in this book about masculinity, or at least society's views and standards for masculinity. Now, of course, much has changed in our society since the 1950s in terms of the status of women, but back in the 1950s, men were expected to be the heads of the household. They were expected to be the breadwinners, the ones providing for the entire family, and Scott is put in a situation where he can no longer do that, and he starts to feel very emasculated because of that. He especially feels emasculated when he starts to become smaller than his wife and daughter, and becoming smaller than his daughter is no longer respecting his authority as her father. And male sexuality is also a major theme in this book. Now, since Scott is shrinking, of course, certain parts of his body are shrinking along with him, if you know what I mean, and size is also really important in sex. And in the novel, it gets to a point where Scott can no longer satisfy his wife sexually, and she can no longer satisfy him sexually. Like, it gets to a point where they're basically on two completely different planes of existence. And throughout the novel, Scott starts getting progressively more and more sexually frustrated, and understandably so, but it does get to a certain point where you do start to lose some sympathy for him, especially in a scene where he starts spying on his daughter's babysitter while she's nude. And that scene is especially creepy because the babysitter is only a 16-year-old girl. Now, at that point in the novel, it's hard to say whether Matheson wanted us to feel sympathy or disgust for Scott, perhaps both. That's another area where you could very much compare this book to I Am Legend in the sense that the situation is kind of turning him into a monster to a certain extent. Of course, he does feel shame for it later on. Now, while the situation that Scott is in is impossible in real life, there is an interesting real-world parallel that I noticed that might not have been intentional, but 2 years before this book was published, in 1954, the United States tested the first hydrogen bomb, and there was a Japanese fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon 5 that was close to the testing site, and the men on that ship got exposed to radioactive fallout. And that real-life tragedy is actually what inspired the original Godzilla. But the fact that the book opens with Scott out on the ocean and getting exposed to a radioactive spray, I don't know if Matheson was maybe taken off of that real-life incident or not. But yeah, The Shrinking Man is a great book, and the premise might seem kind of pulpy, but it really isn't. Aside from being a science fiction novel, this is also a really heartbreaking drama with some really interesting and mature themes. I highly recommend this book. Now, this book was adapted into a film called The Incredible Shrinking Man in 1957, a year after the book was published. Now, because of that movie, later editions of the novel were retitled The Incredible Shrinking Man. Now, I've actually never seen the film adaptation. I know it's considered to be a science fiction classic, but I've never seen it, so I really can't comment on how true or untrue the movie is to the book. Now, the movie was a pretty big success, and there was going to be a sequel. Matheson actually scripted a sequel called The Fantastic Little Girl, but that never came to fruition, but apparently it was going to be about Scott's wife also shrinking down. Now, there was a 1981 film called The Incredible Shrinking Woman, which was directed by Joel Schumacher, which was a comedy, and it was a loose adaptation of this book and a loose remake of the 1957 film. I've only seen parts of that movie, and obviously it changed the gender of the main character. Now, for years they've been trying to do another adaptation of this story. In the early 2000s, they were going to do it with Eddie Murphy, and it was going to be a comedy. Now, in 2015, there was a comic book adaptation of this book from IDW Publishing. I could also see this book, I don't know if it was or not, but I could see this book being an influence on comic book characters like the Atom or Ant-Man. You could even see this book's influence on something like Stephen King's Thinner. But yeah, that was my review on The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson, and bye.